Right now, there is a part of America where the road to the nearest hospital is closed, medication deliveries are on hold, and the only bridge out has been shut down, and the rest of the country is barely paying attention. In the next several minutes, I want to take you through every level of this. Why this place was always going to get hit this way. What is happening right now to the people living inside it. What is quietly breaking beneath the surface, and what is building in the days ahead that most storm coverage never gets to. This storm underwent a level of rapid intensification that forecasters take seriously whenever it occurs in this geography. A winter storm rolled into a geography that was already set up to trap and concentrate it, and instead of passing through the way most storms do, it deepened so fast that meteorologists classified it under a separate category entirely, a bomb cyclone. And once that classification was confirmed, the scale of what was coming became clear. Communities were cut off, emergency crews were staged but couldn't move, and the Mackinac Bridge, a structure that has stood for nearly 70 years and closed for extended periods only a few times. Most closures last just hours, making any multi-day shutdown a rare and serious event, shut down. If you don't already know that bridge, let me tell you exactly why those two words, bridge closed, carry the weight they do in this region. That bridge is the only road that connects the Upper Peninsula to the rest of the United States. There is no alternate route, no highway that loops around. When it closes, the Upper Peninsula becomes, in every real and practical sense, an island, surrounded by water, accessible only by air or boat, cut off from the hospitals south of it, the supply trucks that cross it daily, and the emergency transfers that depend on it. That closure happened at the worst possible moment, during the storm's peak, and it is the detail that every other part of this story flows through. But here is what I want you to hold from the very beginning. The bridge closing is not even close to the most serious part of what is happening there right now. There are things breaking down in the Upper Peninsula at this moment that do not make good photographs. There are risks on rooftops, in the power grid, and building in the frozen rivers below that are harder to explain in a headline but are, for the people living through this, far more immediate than any bridge statistic. And there is a threat building quietly in the background, one that won't arrive in full force for days, and that will reach a community already stretched thin from managing this storm. And when it does, the mainstream coverage almost always misses the real story. So if this is why you come here, if you want the story underneath the story, hit that like button right now because it genuinely helps this kind of careful coverage find the people who need it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this situation is still developing, and we're going to follow it through recovery. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. If you have family in Michigan, if you grew up anywhere in the Great Lakes region, or if you just want to be heard, I want to know, now. Let's start with the question that everything else in this story depends on. Why does this specific corner of America get hit harder than almost anywhere else on the continent, over and over again, in a pattern that goes far deeper than bad luck? The answer starts with a map, and once you see it, you will understand why this region is almost always in the direct path when conditions like these come together. Pull up a map of Michigan and look at just the upper section, the part above the bridge. Really look at it. It is a narrow strip of land barely attached to the rest of the country by that single crossing point, with Lake Superior pushing down from the north, Lake Michigan running along the south, and Lake Huron sitting to the east. Almost every direction you look from anywhere in the middle of the Upper Peninsula, you are facing open water. Not a river, not a pond. Open, deep, constantly evaporating Great Lakes water. Meteorologists understand something about this kind of geography that most people never think about. Water is not passive in the atmosphere. Large open bodies of water continuously release moisture into the air above them, and they do it more powerfully when the water is warmer than the air. When a storm system moves into a space that is nearly surrounded by multiple sources of that moisture, it does not behave the way a normal storm does over land. Land absorbs storm energy. Water feeds it. A storm that enters the Upper Peninsula geography is, in meteorological terms, walking into a refueling station from multiple directions at once. This is why the snowfall records from this region are not accidents. They are the natural result of physics doing exactly what physics does, in exactly this terrain configuration, year after year. The Keweenaw Peninsula, a narrow strip of land that juts north from the Upper Peninsula directly into Lake Superior, holds seasonal snowfall accumulation records that rank among the highest of any permanently inhabited area on the entire continent. People live there year-round. They have for generations, And every winter, the geography they call home does the same thing it has always done. But understanding the geography only explains why this place gets hit hard. It does not fully explain what made this particular storm different from even the worst winters this region has seen. This storm underwent a process of intensification that goes beyond ordinary. Meteorologists measure storm strength by tracking the pressure at a storm center. The lower the pressure, the more intense the storm. When that central pressure drops extremely fast, in a compressed period of time, it crosses a threshold that earns the storm a specific classification. That process is what meteorologists call bombogenesis, and the resulting storm is called a bomb cyclone. The significance of that classification is not its name. It is what the physics of rapid pressure drop actually does. When pressure at a storm's center falls that quickly, the air surrounding it rushes inward with unusual force, not gradually but urgently, in the way water rushes toward a drain when it opens. That rushing air is wind, sustained, powerful, directional wind. And when that wind is loaded with moisture pulled from 3 surrounding lakes, it does not arrive as a light dusting. It arrives as a sustained, powerful wave of snow-loaded wind. That is what hit the Upper Peninsula. Not a heavy snowfall, not an intense blizzard in the conventional sense. A storm that had already built up strength before reaching the region, carrying moisture it had gathered along the way, and aimed directly at terrain with no natural way to disperse the energy. The communities along the southern shore of Lake Superior, Marquette, Munising, Houghton, the smaller towns tucked into river valleys between ridges, sat directly in the path of that energy. These are not communities of strangers to winter. They are communities that have been managing extreme winter conditions for generations. But there is a meaningful difference between a hard winter and a winter that keeps delivering before the previous delivery is fully absorbed. And this region has been in that second category for more than a year now. Here is the piece that makes the geography story more than a background detail. The terrain that concentrates storm energy is the same terrain that holds onto its consequences. The snowpack that builds in the valleys and on the ridges does not drain away. It accumulates. It layers. And by the end of a winter like this one, the weight pressing on roofs, trees and power lines is not just from today's storm. It is the build-up of everything that came before it. But the geography trap, as complete as it is, only works the way it does because of a specific ingredient that sits at its center. The Upper Peninsula is not just isolated by water. It is served by a remarkably thin network of infrastructure. One road in and out, a power grid built along the edges of a vast wilderness, and communities that in some cases sit hours from any major medical facility, even under the best conditions. When a storm concentrates in this geography, everything that serves the people inside it gets compressed by the same forces. The roads that emergency vehicles need, the power lines that run along exposed ridges, the supply routes that pharmacies depend on. The geography that made these communities remarkable also made their lifelines fragile in ways that become visible only when conditions push past a certain point. Lake Superior is not just a backdrop to this storm, it is an active participant. And what scientists have discovered about how that lake has changed over recent years is the piece of this story that fundamentally explains why the recovery from events like this keeps getting harder, not because the storms are always bigger, but because the lake that feeds them is not the same lake it was when this region's infrastructure was built. Most people, when they picture Lake Superior, imagine cold water, ice-covered shores, a frozen dormant presence waiting for spring. Right now, it is none of those things. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area. It has its own internal weather, its own current systems, its own temperature layers that behave in ways that interact directly with the atmosphere above it. And in the winter months, particularly in a year like this one, when much of its surface remains open water rather than locked under ice, it becomes something that every storm passing over it has to reckon with. When cold, dry Arctic air moves over a lake that still holds significant open water, something happens that most weather reports never explain. The temperature difference between the frigid air above and the relatively warmer water below creates a vertical exchange. Moisture rises rapidly off the lake surface and gets pulled upward into the atmosphere where it joins the storm system overhead. Think of it less like a storm passing over water and more like a fire being handed additional fuel from below while it is still burning. The storm does not simply pass through. It feeds, it sustains, it restarts. This is the mechanism that makes snowfall events in the Upper Peninsula behaviourally different from similar-sized storms elsewhere. They do not come through quickly and move on. They stall, they pull from the lake below, they reload. And communities on the southern shore of Lake Superior can find themselves still receiving heavy snow from a storm that, on a national weather map, looks like it should have ended hours ago. That mechanism has always existed in this geography. What is new is what has been happening to the lake itself, and what the combination of that change and a winter like this one produces together. It is not just the total snowfall accumulation that changes, it is the duration, the continuous nature of the snowfall, the way wind-driven snow keeps arriving in fresh waves rather than tapering off. Communities have contingency plans for major snowfall events. Those plans are generally built around a storm that peaks and then eases. What the lake effect refueling mechanism produces is a storm that does not ease on the expected schedule, and response plans built for a conventional timeline can find themselves stretched when the timeline extends. Scientists studying Lake Superior have documented something that genuinely concerned them when they found it. The lake has been warming, not at the same rate as the surrounding land and air, faster. Scientists believe the deeper layers of the lake, which normally slow down this moisture exchange, have also been gradually warming, changing how much energy passing storms can draw from below. The thermal structure of the lake has shifted. Warmer surface water means more available moisture. More available moisture means more fuel for the storms that pass over it. The storms hitting the Upper Peninsula today are drawing from a lake that has measurably changed since the region's roads, power lines and homes were first built. This is not a distant or theoretical change. It is playing out right now, in the wave heights along the southern shore and in the extended duration of this storm's snowfall. There is a detail about Lake Superior that does not surface in most weather coverage, but that helps explain why the warming of this specific body of water matters more than warming in other contexts. Lake Superior sits at an elevation well above sea level. It is one of the coldest of the Great Lakes. The relative difficulty of warming it, compared to a shallower, more accessible body of water, means that the warming scientists are documenting is not a minor background fluctuation. It took sustained, consistent conditions over time to shift its thermal profile measurably, and because the lake resists change slowly, the change that has happened is not quickly reversible. The lake that exists today carries its thermal characteristics into next winter and the winter after that. The storms that pull from it will continue drawing from a changed source. Along the lake's southern shore, the wave activity during the storm reached heights that long-time residents described as among the most significant they had witnessed in years. Waves of this size do not just make dramatic footage. They reshape physical shorelines. They move material that has stayed in one place for decades. They reach storm drains, seawalls, and lower-lying infrastructure that was not built with those wave heights in mind. But here is the thing about wave heights and lake warming that the shoreline footage does not capture. While all of that is happening outside, in the visible, photographable world, something else entirely is happening above people's heads, inside their homes, in the structural framework of every building that has been carrying the weight of this winter. Because the snow that fell during this storm did not land on fresh, recovered, empty rooftops. It landed on surfaces that were already carrying the accumulated load of the months. And what that means for the structural safety of homes across the Upper Peninsula right now, particularly older homes, homes that were never designed for this kind of compounding weight, homes where an elderly resident is alone inside with no one nearby to help, is something that emergency managers treated as a serious documented threat. The question of what is sitting on those rooftops tonight, and what it weighs, and who is responsible for removing it, and whether that removal is even physically possible right now, that question deserves far more than the brief mention it received in the coverage of this storm. When officials issued a roof collapse warning as part of this storm's emergency guidance, most people who read it probably treated it the way we treat most of the routine language that comes with severe weather advisories. They noted it. They moved on. It deserves more than that. A roof collapse warning is not standard language. It is not something emergency managers include as a matter of routine caution in most winter storms, even serious ones. In the majority of major snow events across the country, that specific warning never appears. The fact that it appeared here, officially in writing from the professionals whose entire job is to anticipate and prepare for the worst, is itself information. It tells you something precise about the weight currently sitting on top of structures across the Upper Peninsula. Here is what makes this situation genuinely different from the standard blizzard scenario. The Upper Peninsula entered this storm already carrying one of the heaviest winter snowpacks it has accumulated in years, an entire season's worth of snow, compressed by its own weight, layered over weeks, and partially iced over by the freeze-thaw cycles of a long winter, was already sitting on rooftops before this storm added its load. The roofs in this region were not waiting for this storm from a clean, empty baseline. They were already working. Now consider what this specific storm added on top of that existing weight. Snow is not a uniform substance. Its weight per inch changes dramatically depending on the conditions under which it falls. The dry, cold, powdery snow that falls in January in the Upper Peninsula is among the lightest snow you will find anywhere. It settles loosely. It compresses slowly. A large accumulation of January snow weighs far less than the same depth of snow falling in different conditions. March snow is different. March snow falls in wetter, denser conditions. The air temperatures are closer to the freezing point, which means the snowflakes themselves carry more moisture as they fall. A single inch of March snow can carry dramatically more weight per square foot than a single inch of the same depth January snowfall. When this storm deposited a large accumulation of heavy, dense, late winter snow on top of a snowpack that had been building since the beginning of the season, the combined weight on those rooftops reached a level that structural engineers and emergency managers take seriously. The housing stock that is carrying that weight was not designed for it. Most of the residential housing in the Upper Peninsula was built in the earlier decades of the last century. These are not new construction homes with modern engineering load calculations that account for extreme compounding snow events. They are structures with aging wood frames, decades of exposure to Great Lakes winters, wood that has expanded and contracted through humidity cycles more times than was ever anticipated when the beams were first cut. Many of them sustained damage during last year's ice storm, damage that was repaired under time pressure with available materials in difficult conditions. And that repair work was not the same as a structural restoration. Emergency managers asked residents to rake their roofs. That is the right guidance. Pulling snow off from ground level using long-handled tools is exactly what needs to happen to reduce the load before the structure reaches its limit. It is sound, practical, well-established advice. It is also, in the specific conditions that existed during this storm's peak, winds at dangerous speeds, near zero visibility, temperatures that make extended outdoor exposure dangerous, physically impossible for most residents to do safely, and the residents who most need it done are the ones least able to do it. The Upper Peninsula has an older population. A significant portion of residents are in their 60s, 70s and 80s. Many live alone in homes that have been in their families for generations. The neighbours who would normally step in to help, the kind of community support network that rural regions have always relied on, are themselves pinned inside, dealing with their own roofs, their own driveways, their own animals and properties. The informal community safety net that holds rural America together is under the same strain as every other resource in the region right now. So the roofs sit, the weight accumulates, and the people inside those homes wait. There is something important about the emotional weight of that waiting that deserves to be named. For an older resident alone in a rural home during the storm, the risk is not abstract. It is immediate and personal. That is a different kind of concern than watching storm footage from a warm living room somewhere else. It is close. It is present. And the people in that situation cannot simply leave, because the conditions outside are the reason the roof is under stress in the first place. Emergency response crews have been positioned and ready. But here is the reality of operating in these conditions. Response teams cannot safely enter the most actively dangerous areas until wind speeds drop to a level that allows safe movement and equipment operation. That weather window was not available when the storm was at its peak, and every hour that passes before crews can access a roof that is under stress is an hour that the load continues to build. This is one of the quieter realities of an event like this, not visible from the outside but deeply felt by every person sitting inside an older home, listening to the structure above them carry a weight it was never designed to hold. But here is where I need to tell you something, because it shifts the entire frame of this story. The rooftops are not the most fragile system in the Upper Peninsula right now. The thing that is most at risk, the thing whose failure would reach beyond any single home or single street, is something that most people never see and never think about until the exact moment it stops working. 3 words appeared in the news cycle during the height of this storm that most people processed and moved past without fully absorbing what they meant. The Mackinac Bridge closed. I want to take you deeper into those 3 words than the standard coverage went, because the bridge is not just a road, it is a system. And when that system closes, it takes an entire network of dependencies down with it. dependencies that the people who live north of it have built their daily survival around for decades. The Mackinac Bridge has been standing since the late 1950s. In that entire span, through decades of Great Lakes winters, through ice storms and blizzards and conditions that have challenged every other piece of infrastructure in the region, it has been forced into a full extended closure only rarely, a few times in its nearly 7 decades of service. Each closure is treated as a significant event by the communities that depend on it, because each closure is a signal that something has exceeded the normal operating range of even this remarkably durable structure. This closure happened at the peak of the bomb cyclone. Winds that were already beyond the safe threshold for high-profile vehicles pushed past the point where the bridge authority could keep it open at any capacity. It closed. Completely. Now let me walk you through what that closure means in practice for the people living north of it, and I want you to follow this carefully, because this is the piece of the story that the weather maps and snow total graphics cannot show you. The Upper Peninsula does not have a Level 1 trauma centre. It does not have the kind of hospital equipped to handle the most severe cardiac events, major strokes, serious traumatic injuries from accidents, or complex surgical emergencies that require specialised care. When a person in the Upper Peninsula experiences one of these events, and these events happen in communities of every size to people of every age, the standard care pathway is a transfer, ground ambulance, across the Mackinac Bridge to the advanced care hospitals in Lower Michigan. When the bridge is closed, that transfer cannot happen by road. Helicopter transport exists as a secondary option. Helicopter crews are trained for exactly this kind of situation, but helicopters cannot fly in sustained winds at the speeds that closed this bridge. They cannot navigate in visibility that drops to near zero. They sit on the ground, ready and waiting, for a weather window that during the storm's peak was not available, and whose arrival could not be predicted to the hour. This means that during the storm's peak, someone in the Upper Peninsula needing advanced medical care faced serious delays in getting that help, because the ground and air routes to those hospitals were both unavailable. That is the documented real-world consequence of bridge closure in a region whose medical geography is what it is. For families living south of the bridge with relatives in the Upper Peninsula, a bridge closure is not just a traffic headline. It is a direct worry about whether the people they care about have what they need. Now extend that same logic to something more quiet, something affecting not one person at a time, but thousands simultaneously. Prescription medications. Pharmacies in smaller Upper Peninsula communities, the towns that serve the rural population between the larger anchoring cities, operate on lean inventory models. They are not large regional distribution hubs with weeks of stock on hand. They receive deliveries on regular schedules by truck across that bridge and through the supply chain that the bridge makes possible. Most smaller town pharmacies carry enough of their most common medications to supply their regular customers for several days under normal conditions. The medications we're talking about are not optional. Blood pressure management, heart rhythm control, insulin for diabetes, thyroid medication, anti-seizure medication. The daily medications that keep an older, chronically ill population stable and functional. These are not medications a person can simply skip for a week and catch up on later. For people on critical daily medications, even a few missed doses can create health problems that build quickly. A bridge closure that extends beyond a few days does not just inconvenience the supply chain, it begins to create genuine gaps in medication availability for the population that needs it most. And the population that depends most heavily on daily prescription medication in the Upper Peninsula is the same population that is least likely to have prepared a multi-week emergency supply, because nothing in their experience had made them believe they needed to. A ferry contingency exists. It has been part of the region's emergency planning for decades, and it is worth being honest about what a ferry contingency actually provides versus what a closed bridge removes. The bridge moves a volume of vehicle traffic, commercial trucks, emergency vehicles, personal vehicles, that is simply not replicable by any ferry operation that exists or could realistically be stood up in emergency conditions. A ferry can move people. It can move limited cargo. What it cannot do is function as a freight corridor for the kind of regular, large-scale commercial resupply that keeps pharmacies, grocery stores, and medical facilities stocked. The contingency is real, and it matters, but it is not a replacement for the bridge. It is a partial mitigation of a partial closure impact. The gap between those two things is where the real vulnerability lives. The emergency managers and health officials responsible for the Upper Peninsula are not passive in situations like this. They have plans, They are working, they are professionals managing a genuinely difficult set of circumstances with every tool available to them. But those plans were designed for shorter closures, less extreme weather conditions, and a population profile that has shifted considerably since the plans were written. The population is older now, more medically dependent, less mobile, more rural, and while all of this is pressing down on a region that is already at capacity just managing the storm itself, something else is quietly coming apart. The power grid, the aging, patched, repeatedly tested power grid that has been holding together through a winter that has been asking more of it than any winter in recent years, is about to face the kind of sustained stress that the people who maintain it know is already under more pressure than a typical winter. Just over a year ago, before this blizzard, before this bomb cyclone, before this particular bridge closure, the Upper Peninsula went through something that the people who lived it have not stopped thinking about. An ice storm moved through the region, not heavy snow, ice, a coating of solid, heavy ice that settled over everything. Trees that had stood for decades snapped at the base. Power lines that had survived one brutal Great Lakes winter after another came down in the hundreds across the region. The damage was unlike anything that most residents had seen in their lifetimes, and the restoration effort that followed was one of the largest and most difficult utility mobilizations in the region's recent history. It took weeks. In some of the more rural and remote communities, full power took several weeks to restore, well beyond what most people had prepared for. People managed with generators, with wood stoves, with neighbours and community centres. They managed the way people in the Upper Peninsula always manage, with a combination of practical skill and quiet endurance. But here is what the restoration timeline does not capture. When repairs happen under that kind of time pressure, in winter conditions with limited available materials, with a workforce already stretched thin from weeks of continuous effort, they are not always the same quality as a planned replacement. Some of the line work done in the aftermath of last year's ice storm was what the industry calls temporary repair. Fixes intended to restore function quickly, with the understanding that a full permanent replacement would follow when conditions allowed. Patches, not overhauls, and those patches have been carrying the load ever since. And before we get to the workforce dimension, consider what it means to patch a power system in the middle of a Great Lakes winter. Crews working in temperatures that make equipment harder to operate. Ground conditions that slow every truck and every movement. Daylight windows that are short. The physical difficulty of the work compounds the shortage of available workers. A repair that might take 2 days in summer takes 4 in winter. The delays cascade. There is a workforce dimension to this story that does not make the news, but that the people responsible for maintaining the UP's electrical grid understand very well. The number of trained electrical linemen, the workers who climb poles in difficult conditions and physically restore power after storm damage, in the Upper Peninsula has been declining for years. It is not a sudden development. It is a slow, steady contraction driven by retirement, by population decline in rural areas, and by the reality that younger workers with those skills have more job options than they once did, including in places where the winters are less punishing. The workforce available to repair the grid after a major damage event is considerably smaller than it was a generation ago. The damage potential of a major event has not decreased proportionally. That gap between the damage that extreme weather can cause and the repair capacity available to respond has been widening quietly for a long time, and events like this one expose it. So when the winds of this storm hit the power infrastructure of the Upper Peninsula, hitting lines that were already carrying patches from last year's ice storm damage, running through a region that entered this winter with a reduced maintenance workforce, some of those patches did not hold. Communities that had already lost power during earlier events this winter faced another outage. In some cases, residents who had already burned through a significant portion of their backup fuel supplies this season found themselves calling on those reserves again. Many residents in rural townships entered this storm already relying on a generator that has been running heavily since the last major outage. A generator runs on fuel, has parts that wear, and was built for occasional backup use, not for the kind of repeated heavy operation that a winter with multiple major outages demands. The third time it is called upon in a single winter is not the same as the first time. That is what cumulative disaster looks like in a community with limited resources. Each event by itself might be manageable. What makes the Upper Peninsula's situation unusual is not the severity of any single event. It is the pattern. One event arriving before the last one has fully healed. Emergency management professionals have a term for what happens to community resilience under this kind of repeated compressed stress. They call it disaster fatigue. Not just among residents, but among the responders themselves, among the utility workers, among the emergency managers, among the volunteers who show up every time and who are showing up again now. Fatigue is not a failure of character. It is a real and well-documented limit, one that affects responders and residents alike. And communities operating under disaster fatigue do not respond to the third event with the same capacity they brought to the first one, even when every individual involved is giving everything they have. Emergency management teams know this. Utility companies know it. The elected officials who have been managing the Upper Peninsula's ongoing infrastructure challenges know it. They are not operating without awareness. They are operating within real constraints, budget constraints, workforce constraints, geographic constraints that make every decision a trade-off. But while the grid is being managed, and the bridge closure is being managed, and the rooftops are being managed, something else entirely is building. Something that does not announce itself with wind and snowfall. Something that will arrive quietly, in the form of water, after the storm has technically ended and the coverage has moved on. The blizzard is the headline. It always is. But there is a part of this story that the headline will never cover, because by the time it arrives, the storm will be over and the cameras will have gone somewhere else. Let me tell you what the data says is likely coming, and why it matters more than most storm coverage ever explains. When temperatures rise after a significant winter accumulation event, and a warming pattern is clearly in the forecast for the days following this storm, all of that snow begins to melt, not in a slow, controlled, gradual way that the land can absorb quietly. In March, with increasing daylight and warming air, melt can happen faster than most people expect, and all the water that was locked in solid form as snow is suddenly moving, looking for somewhere to go. Under normal circumstances, the ground absorbs a meaningful portion of that meltwater, soil takes it in, water tables rise slowly. The transition from winter to spring happens gradually enough that rivers and drainage systems can manage the volume. The ground in the Upper Peninsula right now is not normal. It has been locked under freezing temperatures for an entire winter. Frozen ground does not absorb water. It rejects it. Every drop of meltwater that hits a frozen surface immediately becomes runoff. Surface water moving toward the lowest point available as fast as gravity allows. The lowest points in the Upper Peninsula are its rivers, the Escanaba, the Menominee, the Taquamenon, the Ontonagon. Rivers that run through the heart of the region, through the communities that have been built along their banks for generations, through the valleys that were always the most logical places to settle because they offered shelter from wind and proximity to fresh water. These rivers right now are frozen, not lightly, but solidly, in a year when the winter has been severe enough to build ice, cover thicker than what many residents have seen in recent years. When warm meltwater begins flowing into a frozen river system, the ice does not melt cleanly from the top down. It breaks. It lifts from the riverbed. It begins moving downstream in large, irregular chunks, driven by the current building beneath it. And as those chunks move, they encounter obstacles, bridges, bends in the river, narrows where the channel tightens, and they pile up. A pile of river ice acting as a dam is called an ice jam. An ice jam flooding is categorically different from the gradual forecasted flooding that meteorologists track with river gauges and advanced warning systems. It is different because the warning window is short, the release is sudden, and the force of water behind a breaking ice dam is not proportional to what river levels were showing before the jam formed. Water that backs up quietly over hours releases all at once. That dynamic is what gives ice jam floods their particular destructive character, and it is what makes them harder to communicate in advance than a standard rising water forecast. The historical record of this specific region shows this pattern clearly. The worst flood events in the Upper Peninsula's documented history have followed exactly this sequence. Record winter snowpack, frozen ground, rapid spring warm-up, and ice jam release on the rivers. The flooding that followed some of those events caused damage that exceeded what the original winter storm produced. Neighborhoods that had stood safely through the blizzard were underwater weeks later when the melt arrived. In some documented cases, recovery from the flooding took longer than recovery from the original winter storm. The current situation carries the conditions for this exact pattern. Large accumulated snowpack, solidly frozen ground, a forecast warming trend already confirmed for the coming days. Frozen rivers that will be fed by that meltwater and will have to manage the resulting ice movement. River monitoring is active. Gauge stations are watched. Emergency management teams are aware of what the next phase of this event may produce. But there is a hard, practical problem sitting underneath all of that awareness. The resources that would be deployed for a flood response, the heavy vehicles, the water rescue teams, the emergency shelter capacity, are currently deployed managing the blizzard. The same crews, the same equipment, the same officials running on reduced sleep, managing the current emergency, knowing that another one may be forming behind it. There is no real gap between a blizzard response and a flood response. One begins before the other has fully ended. The communities most at risk are the ones that sit in river valleys, the same valleys that historically provided shelter from winter winds and made them attractive places to build. The same geography that made these river valleys good places to build, shelter from wind, access to fresh water, is what puts them in the path of ice jam flooding. That is not a problem with a simple fix. It is the nature of where people chose to settle and of what those natural systems do when conditions push past a certain point. Understanding this, that a blizzard and the flood that follows it are part of the same chain, changes the question we should be asking about this region. The question is not just how bad was the storm. The question is, what happens to a place that keeps getting hit before the last hit is fully healed? Let me step back from the specific details for a moment, because the real story here, the one that this blizzard is a chapter of, not the beginning of, is about something larger than any single storm. What is actually happening in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is a convergence. Not one problem, several arriving together, each one making the others harder to manage. Lake Superior is warmer than it used to be. The change is measured, documented, and consistent across multiple years of scientific observation. It is not dramatic in the way that grabs headlines. You could stand on the shore of Lake Superior and not notice it with your eyes. But that extra warmth translates directly into more available moisture for the storms that pass over it. More fuel, longer burn, extended storm duration. The storms hitting this region today are drawing from a lake that carries more energy than the lake that existed when the bridges and the power lines and the hospitals were planned and built. At the same time, the atmospheric pattern that shapes winter across the northern part of the country has become less predictable in recent years, according to climate researchers. Cold air that once stayed more contained near the Arctic now breaks loose more often, pushing south in sharp pulses, a pattern researchers say has been increasing, the kind of intrusion that, when it meets the moisture rising from a warmer Great Lakes system, produces the concentrated explosive winter events that we are watching now. Neither change by itself would be as significant. Together, they create a weather environment that the infrastructure of the Upper Peninsula was not designed for. And that infrastructure, the power grid, the bridge, the housing stock, the hospital system, the pharmacy supply chain, was built for the winters of 50 and 60 years ago. It was designed, funded, and staffed for a set of conditions that no longer fully describes what this region faces each year. It is not that the infrastructure is neglected. In many cases, it is maintained as well as the available resources allow. It is that the gap between what the infrastructure was designed to handle and what it is actually being asked to handle has been growing. That gap is what you're watching this week. The people who live in the Upper Peninsula are not a community that needs us to feel sorry for them. They are, in my experience following communities through difficult events, some of the most practically resilient people anywhere in the country. They know how to handle hard winters. They have been doing it their whole lives. They know their neighbours. They know how to help each other. They know how to wait out storm and then go to work fixing what broke. But resilience is not the same as unlimited capacity. And the thing that this season, with its ice storm, its repeated outages, and now this bomb cyclone, is testing is not whether the people of the Upper Peninsula are tough enough. They are. It is testing whether a community can keep absorbing the cost of compounding events before the recovery from the previous one is complete. And the honest answer to that question is that every community has a limit, even the most resilient ones. What the people of the Upper Peninsula need right now is not our fear for them. They don't want that. They are not afraid. They are managing. The people inside this event are not asking for our anxiety. They are asking, in the way communities always ask quietly and practically, for understanding of what is actually happening, and for the resources and decisions that understanding produces. That is what accurate coverage of an event like this is supposed to generate, not alarm, not helplessness. The kind of clear-eyed awareness that leads to the right questions being asked by the right people at the right level. What this region deserves is understanding. Real understanding. Not the headline version, not the snow total version, but the human version. the version that accounts for the real pressures on people managing limited fuel, limited medication, and limited contact with family on the other side of a closed bridge. The version that includes the infrastructure that has been quietly strained, holding on with the help of professionals who are doing extraordinary work under extraordinary pressure. That is the story I wanted to make sure you understood today. If you stayed with me through all of it, thank you, genuinely. That kind of attention, for this kind of material, is what makes it worth doing carefully rather than quickly. If this is the depth you come to this channel for, hit that like button. Share this with someone who has family in the Upper Peninsula or anywhere in the Great Lakes region, because this story is still developing, and the people affected by it deserve to have it told accurately and completely. Subscribe so you are here when we cover what comes next, particularly as the melt cycle begins and we start watching those river systems closely. And drop a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have family caught in this event. Tell me what part of this story landed most clearly for you.